And this week we're going to be talking about how our strength can become our weakness, and how our weakness can actually bring us deeper into our power. I often use the term authentic personal power, and this is definitely what I'm talking about when I say power in this title. So, one of the great parts about this conversation is it's the kind of conversation that's counterintuitive. And by that, I mean that, we all love our strengths, right? We all want to lean heavy on our strengths and ignore our weaknesses. But in this conversation, I think you're going to see how strengths have their limits and our weaknesses actually can be a portal to power. So before I get talking about this, I want to encourage you, please, if you enjoy these videos, to hit the subscribe button and click that little bell icon if you're watching on YouTube. That lets you know when I release new stuff. Okay, so now on to how strengths become weaknesses. So I think that we learn best from example, and I am going to use myself as I commonly do. Maybe that's why we call this What's Real with Adrien, because we put him up on the stand a lot here and talk about him as a test study, you might say, right? So I'm going to explain to you how I learned one of my biggest strengths was actually a pretty big weakness, and then how the weakness led me to power. I'm going to start that by talking about the fact that I'm very naturally outgoing, right? In the personality, I'm an extroverted personality type, and I'm actually pretty good at talking, right? I have always been able to express myself pretty confidently and pretty successfully, I think. And this has been the way that I've gone through my life. Now, you might think, by the way, that this is why I'm doing this here right now, because I have this natural skill. And sure, it plays a part. But as you're going to see, it's actually not why I'm here talking to you like this right now. It has a lot more to do with what my weaknesses had to show me. So the first time that I realized that there was probably not the first time, let's be honest, right? But when I really started to realize that there was a limit to my strengths was probably about 2-3 years into my marriage. And I started to realize that this gift, if you want to call it, that I had of gab, of being able to express myself, was hitting a wall. And that was because I leaned on this strength so much that it was becoming a weakness, which is to say, I wasn't very good at listening. I wasn't very good at being open, like being, really considering someone else's opinions and feelings. And this started to show with my marriage. As, the honeymoon period, as they say, started to wear off, right? And you're into real life, and we had a kid, and finances were terrible, and life was tough. Well, I was really good at expressing how I felt about that. And I was even really good at telling my wife how she felt about it. But I wasn't so good at actually listening to my wife. And this led to problems. My wife's personality type, as I've discussed many times, is the exact polar opposite of mine, right? She's very good at listening. She's very quiet by nature. She's very introverted. So that set us up really good for me talking and her listening, right? But it led to problems as we tried to work through our issues, right? Our challenges in life as a married couple. Now, as you can probably see right away, this is kind of what's fun about this too. My strengths led me to my weaknesses. Well, my wife's the same, meaning they were the opposites, right? One of these days, I really think I want to do a live stream about how opposites attract and why, because I think it's a very common experience in our relationships, but I digress. But, the point is that I was realizing that she had a strength that I didn't. And because I had a deep and profound love and respect for my wife, I started to notice this gift that she had and that I was lacking. And it took a long time. I don't want to oversell this as far as like, oh, I noticed it. It took me quite a while before I really valued this gift that my wife had. To continue with that little digression, of course, she was learning from me a little bit about how to be more outgoing, how to express the importance of it, being inspired to see me do it and then want to do it herself. It took her a long time to do that also. And we're both working on these things because they're not our natural strengths, right? So as I started to realize this in my marriage, I had to start looking at this place that I wasn't good at. Like I was so good at expressing myself. And like I said, even expressing to my wife how she felt. And here's the funny thing. I wasn't even necessarily wrong a lot of times about how she felt, but I wasn't giving her the opportunity and the space, as I like to say, to do it herself. I was pushing, I was, intruding on her sovereignty, you might say, right? Like, she has the right to express it herself. And if she doesn't do it really good right away, which was part of the issue, right? Because that was her weakness, I would just trample all over it. You probably can imagine that this led to some pretty big problems, and it really did. And I'm glad to say that we saw ourselves through. And as I said, I know that it was because of my profound love and respect for my wife, and vice versa. I think that we were able to find our way through it. But the finding our way through it turned into a gift. Because once I was willing to look at my weakness, I was able to access the power that lied within there, which is that I started to listen a little more. I started to quiet down a little bit. Another part of being an extroverted personality type too is that I have a lot of energy, right? So it was hard for me to be still. This is part of why, so my wife had the opportunity. Does that make any sense? These were things that I needed to face. And what happened was that when I would, because I had this natural gift of strength, of speech, if you want to say that, and energy, I was always trying to work it out, to overpower the situation in a way. It's not what my intention was, but that's what I was doing because I was leaning on my strength too much. A way I like to think about this is it's kind of like a scale, right? So if we lean on our strengths too much, they turn into weaknesses. And if we lean into weakness too much, we'll never feel our strength, right, or our power. So there's some sort of balance between leaning into our strengths and leaning into our weaknesses. We got to find that balance. And when we find that balance, that's when we start to step into our authentic personal power. I'm always going to be an extroverted personality, really. That's my bend, right? It's not that I'm trying to change that when I open myself to weaknesses or my weaknesses, but I need to balance that. And as I did, again, I started to find that I had the power to do that. So let me explain, the first thing I wanted to point out was the counterintuitive nature, right? Like we love our strengths and we hate our weaknesses. That's just kind of a natural bend that we have. And that's because we think it's all about strength. But every strength has a limit. And every weakness has a gift. This is the counterintuitive thing that I want to share with you, right? That's the first thing. Then I want to try to help you understand why. Why is that so? And I've already hinted it, but I want to say it clearly, right? If we lean into our strengths too much, it's going to lead to certain issues. And that issue is going to be, I can summarize it in the simplest way by saying it will close us down in a certain way. If you think about the way that I was expressing my situation, right? I was so busy talking and fixing and working and that I never allowed my wife the space to tell me and share with me what she was actually feeling and to give her the opportunity to feel her own sovereignty in a way, right? So I was closing down my heart, actually, even though I didn't mean to do that, and my mind, because I was the kind of listener that was always just waiting to say what I wanted to say, right? I'm listening sometimes, but that's just to find out where either you're off from what I think or, we share something there. Oh yeah, that's what I'm trying to say, right? That was the kind of listener. I was always trying to gauge it upon myself, like what I was trying to share. Once I calmed down a little bit and I got a little quieter, I was able to actually listen with no agenda. Or with a limiting agenda, right? Slowing down the agenda. I can honestly and say that at this point of the game, that gets pretty low. My agenda's I don't really have one. I'm just listening. Every once in a while I fall back into old habits, but this is more where I come from, right? So before I was leaning into my strengths, and the reality was because I didn't want to look at my weakness. When we try to avoid our weaknesses by leaning on our strengths, we stumble into what I call force. And there's a really big difference between force and power. Strength can go both ways. That's kind of an interesting and fun thing about strength. It can go into force, and that's only when we are leaning into it too much to hide or run away from our weaknesses. Or we can, if we're standing in our power, if we're open, then our strengths are just strengths. They actually can lead and feed into our power. I hope you can see that. So in other words, it's how you use your strength and why is probably more accurate. Why are you leaning into your strength? Are you trying to hide something? Are you trying to run from something? I also want to express, because I'm explaining one personality type here in a way. A lot of times what happens when we lean into our strength too much is we close down by having a certain sort of arrogance. Now, I think you could easily tell the arrogance that I had by being so good at speaking and knowing what was right and all that kind of stuff. But there's another way. By being quiet, you could be leaning into that strength. That was my wife's strength, right? It was really easy for her to do that, actually, because that was her natural bent. So she would just listen and shut down in a certain way, right? And there was a certain level of closedness to that, because it was her strength and she could let it go. See, I could never do that. I could never let it go because that wasn't my personality type, right? But for her, she could pretend like, in a way, right? She could have a certain sense of arrogance in a weird way too. Don't mean to, but that she could lean into this strength only because she didn't want to face her weakness, which was that she wasn't very good at expressing herself. Does that make some sense? So it all depends on where we stand, what our strengths and what our weaknesses are, right? The picture will change dramatically, but the root causes are always the same. That we're trying to avoid our weaknesses by leaning into our strengths. And when we do that, it turns into force. So back to the force versus power. Power is very different than force. Force is when we're trying to overcompensate for something. That's why I couldn't ever be quiet. That's why I couldn't just let something go, because I was overcompensating for my sense of weakness in this other area, that I just couldn't be still. I just couldn't listen. Power is much more open. And this is the gift, by the way. We're going to get into this in a second, but this is the gift that weakness has to offer, actually, is a certain level of openness. Power allows that because it doesn't feel the need to overcompensate. It doesn't need, it feels comfortable with our strengths and our weaknesses. It's fine both ways. That's why it helps give us that balance, right? Because power isn't trying to compensate. It has a sense of its authentic personal power. I don't know you, who you are watching this, but I want you to know right now that you have this power. It resides within you right now. So really the game is exposing it, right? And here is the beautiful gift of weakness. When we willingly face our weaknesses, we open this portal to power. Because all of a sudden now we open, right? I remember when I first realized just how powerful this is, meaning our weaknesses in a way. And it was when I was starting to really make myself available as a spiritual teacher or a life coach or however you want to label that. And I started working with people. And I realized, and it wasn't surprising in a certain way, just I gained a certain amount of clarity about it. They only reached out to me when they were in a place of weakness, right? When they had reached the end of themselves, you might say. When they couldn't figure out what to do. Like usually it was when their marriage was falling apart so much that somebody was talking about divorce, or their anxiety level was so high that they just couldn't cope with it anymore. They were missing work or things like that, or a million other examples when they just couldn't cope with it anymore. When their weaknesses were they were running into the wall of them, if you will, right? They just couldn't avoid it anymore. Leaning into their strengths wasn't working anymore. Maybe that's what I'm trying to express. I often said to them, they would call me or message me, whatever the way was, and I would say, the moment that you did that, you started a shift. You started to step into your power because you opened. Before, you were closed. You said, I got it. I can do this. I'm going to lean on my strengths. I can get through this, right? Or you were so deep into your weakness, you just felt like you couldn't do anything, right? If you were leaning the scale that way. But all of a sudden, something shifted. And what that something was the awakening of your authentic personal power. And often it takes running into or facing headfirst our weakness in order to crack open in that way. This is the beauty of weakness. This is the gift. And this is counterintuitive, right? Because we all want to avoid it. But if we can see the fact that we need to balance these things, because if we run one way or the other, we're going to run into trouble. I'm telling you, there was times in my marriage that the weakness that came from my strength almost ruined me in our marriage. And I hinted to this earlier when I said that, you might think that my talking or my ability to speak and my extroverted personality is why I'm here before you right now. It's actually not. It was actually only when I got in touch with the stillness and silence inside of me. That wasn't really my natural bend. But once I opened to that, that's when my life really shifted. And that is why I feel confident and comfortable to sit here before you now. Because I know that there's a certain level of balance to that in my life, and I can sit here and speak to you about this authentically. This is part of the authentic personal power. Authenticity is incredibly important, and I try my best, actually, as a human being, really, to live that way. I'm not perfect, which is part of the authentic part, right? But I work very hard to make sure that I am practicing whatever it is that I'm speaking about. And I would have never been able to be this authentic with you right now if I hadn't faced head first this weakness of mine. And there was many more, by the way. But honestly, this was the primary one. The moment that I really opened myself to the three pillars that I'm always talking about, the silence, space, and stillness, did my life shift in a way that I was able to offer my life up as a service. I want to say this, and I don't want to embarrass my wife, but so much of that has to do with her. And seeing her the way that she was, how inspired I was by the way in which she carried herself that way, and how comfortable she was in that space. It was very inspiring to me to have her around. It was even, that sounds very intellectual. It wasn't very intellectual. It was actually at a very energetic level. And I hope that I can provide some of that for you, actually, as I'm thinking about this, as I'm sharing this. I hope that's a little bit of what you get. That energetic shift, that sense, that inspiration, not just intellectually as I talk about your strengths and your weakness, but that you can sense through this camera the authenticity through which I'm trying to share. And that it inspires you to go there. Your story may be totally different than mine. That doesn't actually matter much, because it's my authenticity that I'm trying to share that is actually the utmost importance. And I only came across this authentic part of myself once I was willing to open to my weakness. I hope you can feel that. It's the beauty of this. It's a proof in a certain way that life is not what you think it is. It's so much more. We all prize our strengths. We all want to, I've said this before too, the extroverted personality type is highly prized in our society, right? Because we're the doers, so to speak, and we're the motive. We're always doing things and talking and getting things done, and we don't esteem the other one so much, that silence, stillness, and space. And I'm telling you right now, as a global society, we really need to start engaging at that level. First of all, there's much more depth there, believe it or not. And second of all, we need to temper. There's something very beautiful about the human tendency to want to do and produce and create. But we need to temper it with those three pillars that I was talking about: silence, stillness, and space. From there, too, this is part of how we can open to our weaknesses through those three things, because we have to be able to give our strengths and our weaknesses a little space, a little stillness to be able to look. If you're too tied in one way or the other, you can't actually see it. I remember that was so true for me. Like, it was such a natural gift, right? This talk, gab, that I never had that silence, stillness, and space, right? So I never was able to really see its limits. So we've talked about the counterintuitive nature. We've talked about the power that lies in weakness. I want to quote a very dear friend, because here's the thing that's also, you can't avoid this. This is kind of what I want to express right now. Meaning that we try to lean into our weaknesses and lean into our strengths and avoid our weaknesses. But I don't know if you've ever noticed, it doesn't work out too well. Like, eventually, sometime you run into, like I did, like you run into the limits of your strength and they become weaknesses, right? This is not some mistake. This is built into the whole system, as far as I can tell, right? And that's because, to quote a friend of mine, David Peters, reality has an opinion too, right? Just because you want to lead into your strengths doesn't mean you're going to be able to get away with it. Reality has something to say about it too. And this is part of why you can't. You need to realize that you need to find this balance. You need to be willing to open to your weaknesses, because reality isn't going to let you get away with it too long. And even if you do, if you look closely, if you take a minute to slow down, to quiet, you'll notice there's certain parts of your life that it's being compromised. Because we can't just lean in there. Our weaknesses are there for a reason. I personally, I know it's challenging, but I love that part. It's built into the system, So now we're okay, Adrien, I'm willing to look at my weaknesses. Okay, you've talked me into it. I'm going to take a gander there. How do I do it, though? It's my weakness, right? Well, first, you've already done a big part, because you have to be willing. You have to be willing to do it. You have to see the merit. I think willingness, it helps with willingness to realize that there's merit there, right? So in other words, there's a good reason to look. That's what I'm trying to share here, and hopefully I'm doing a decent job of that. So you can see that, I see what he's saying. He's got a point. So now I'm willing. How do I go about actually, engaging in my weakness, you might say? Well, here's another really fun and sort of counterintuitive thing. You can actually use your strength, right? So for me, I was good at talking. I was a high energy person, right? I knew I was good at working, so to speak, if that makes any sense, right? I had the energy to do things, to talk, and to get things accomplished. And I realized at some point that I had to kind of turn that energy that I had back into myself, refocus that into my ability to be quiet. Like, in other words, use that energy to calm myself down. I know that sounds counter, but it's not. Actually, it does work. Now, that's that way. Let's say you're my wife's personality type, where, it's harder for you to speak, easier for you to be quiet. Well, what that means is you have a natural ability to allow to some degree. That is a beautiful gift. So, be willing to talk, right? To look at the weakness. And then lean into your natural gift of allowing, because the opportunities come. Allow yourself to do that. Open to it. Take the time to actually lean into this ability to, because life will give you the opportunities, right? You're always going to run into that. That's my point, is like reality, or I should say David's point, right? Reality has an opinion too. At some point, life is going to make you have to face this weakness. But at that same moment, it's an opportunity to engage in it. So if your natural bend is to be quiet, is to allow that moment to be as it is, with a willingness to look the other way, to look into your weakness, to see, how could I engage here? You don't have to run from it, and you're not going to do it great. I remember the first many times that I was trying to be quiet and still and listen to my wife. I think maybe she sensed that I was trying to do something, but it wasn't working very good, right? I mean, there was a facade of listening still, but it was me working through it, right? So then, if you're trying to talk and that's not your natural bend, you don't expect yourself to be Shakespeare, right? You're not going to do a great job of it. But the first part would be to open yourself to it and engage in just saying, I'd really like to say something here. I'm not even sure what it is. And then see what happens. Allow it. You'll be surprised. Again, you have this power in you. I don't know who you are that I'm looking at here into this camera, but I do know that you have this power. As much as I know the sun will rise in the east, I know that you have this power. All you have to do is open to it. Is start by being willing to look at your weakness. And also, the flip side is to be willing to see the limits to your strengths. That there's more. There's more than you thought there was to you and to life. To always be leaning on our strengths is very limiting in a certain way, because there's more to you than that. I actually have the ability to be quiet. Actually, my quiet times turned into my favorite times of my day. Funny enough, when I meditate, when I'm being still. I would have never been able to find that place of joy if I wasn't willing to look at my weaknesses. I hope this makes some sense, and I hope that it inspires you to start looking and engaging in a new way. Like, again, realize that they're not what you thought they were. Strengths aren't that great, and weaknesses aren't that bad. They each offer a gift. And it's for you to explore and find the balance and step into your own authentic personal power. I don't know if we have any questions. No questions. I didn't talk about. I always forget to do that. I really apologize. I'm a gabber. Did I mention that? So I always mean to mention somewhere in the middle or the beginning to please ask a question if if it comes up, and maybe to be thinking about that as you're listening. But maybe it's even better just for you to listen and be still yourself, I suppose. As always, I want to thank you for your time. It's very precious.